Severe hypothermia is a serious life-threatening condition caused by a dangerous drop in body temperature from prolonged exposure in cold temperatures. And so nothing was more shocking than when 19-year-old Jean Hilliard began waking up after being left outside in the cold for over 6 hours. It was the night of December 20th, 1980, when 19-year-old Jean Hilliard was on her way to her parents' home in Langby, Minnesota after meeting up with some friends to spend the night in town. There was only so much they could do in their hometown. Langby was a very small town in Polk County, Minnesota, being home to a population of just about 123 in the 1980s, but only to 90 people now. It has a total area of 0.29 square miles, and being such a small town, there wasn't a lot of nightlife as expected from somewhere like a big city. However, Jean, friend Wally Nelson, date Paul, and a few others, being your average young adults, knew the hottest spots around town, and so they would spend that night at the Foston American Lounge, the best place to go at the time within driving distance. After a good night out drinking and dancing with her friends, they all would leave the lounge at around 12 a.m., each heading home, including Wally, who had left with a woman that night, and Jean, who was en route to her parents' home. She was driving her dad's Ford LTD and decided that tonight she would take a shortcut driving along a country gravel road just south of Langby. And it was a very cold night. Temperatures were reaching below 20 degrees Fahrenheit. It was dark out, the road was quite icy, and Jean was definitely not dressed for the night. All she had on was a jacket, pants, and cowboy boots, but of course she was in the warmth of her dad's car, and this was a very small town, so it couldn't be too long before she would arrive to her parents. All was normal when the road would progressively become more and more slippery. Suddenly, Jean, who was simply driving en route to her parents' house on a road she was more than familiar with, would lose control of her car, and here she is uncontrollably sliding on this road. Jean would try to get the car back in the center, and this was proven to not be an easy task. A frantic Jean would then continue to slide more and more away from the middle of the road when suddenly the sliding would come to a halt. Jean would quickly assess the situation when she would soon notice that her car had become stuck in a ditch just off of the road. At this point, her adrenaline is up, heart rate is pumping, but Jean is painfully aware of the situation she's in and immediately starts thinking to herself, okay, I could stay here and wait for help, or I could get out of the car and get help myself. Now, this was a small town, and it being in the middle of the night, Jean knew it was a very unlikely chance that somebody would be passing by this little country road and help her out in this situation. Jean would realize that the latter was likely the best option. Jean knew exactly where she was. She'd been on this road before and knew that her friend Wally's house, who she just spent the night hanging out with, was just a few miles away. All she had to do was walk a few miles and be able to comfortably spend the night in the warmth of his home and deal with the car situation the next morning when it's bright outside, everyone's awake, and the proper services would be available to help recover her car. And so Jean, who is severely underdressed for the temperature, would begin this walk knowing that she would be there in warmth in no time. This, however, would not be the case. She would walk 10 minutes, 20 minutes, heading over hills, thinking she had just reached this place, when she would continually realize that it was not there. Jean had miscalculated how far Wally's place was, and so she would continue walking, just frustrated that this trip was taking so long. And as she continued to walk, she would progressively get more and more cold. 2 more miles would go by when finally, after about an hour of walking in temperatures below 20 degrees Fahrenheit, Jean would finally see Wally's house through some trees. She would walk up to his front yard. However, just before reaching the doorstep, Jean would immediately collapse. It's now about 7 a.m. the next morning when Wally would wake up and peek his head outside his windows as he usually would in the mornings to start his day. This time, however, he couldn't help but notice something unusual in his lawn. He noticed this thick layer of snow, which was odd because normally in the mornings the snow would lay flat on the ground. This morning in particular, there was a large misplaced bump just in front of him in his lawn. What possibly could have been on his lawn causing this strange thick layer. And Wally, who is now curious, would stare just a bit harder to figure out what possibly could have been in his yard. Yet once he got a closer look, what he would see would leave him absolutely mortified. Wally was in shock because right in front of him would lay his friend Jean, blacked out on his yard with her eyes fully wide open. And so a surprised Wally would quickly run to his front door, sprinting right towards Jean, immediately grab her by her coat collar and slide her towards his porch when he would notice that her body was completely frozen solid. It felt as if she was as hard as a board of wood. She was just so solid and stiff. And at this point, Wally was convinced that Jean was dead. It had been a whole 6 hours Jean lay there unconscious in below freezing temperatures. He would, however, take a closer look and would notice air bubbles coming out of her nose. Wally now knew that his friend indeed was alive and would immediately request the help of the woman he had brought home from the night before to help pick Jean up and load her stiff body into the back seat of his truck. So here's Jean, whose body is frozen solid, and Wally and this woman trying to pick her up when they would soon realize that her body was too stiff to fit into the back of his truck. And so they would instead load Jean diagonally into Wally's date's car where Jean's stiff body could actually fit, and they would immediately rush her to the Foston hospital. And so the three would finally arrive to the hospital and bring Jean inside, and Wally would explain, look, my friend is frozen solid. I'm not sure how long she's been outside, but it must have been a while. And doctors would immediately begin working to try waking Jean up and raising her core temperature. The doctors would attempt to get an IV needle into Jean's arm when they would realize her body was too frozen solid for the needles to penetrate her skin. And so after a few broken needles, the doctors, who have now had low hopes for Jean's survival, would decide to still try warming her up. They would diligently spend the next several hours wrapping Jean in electric heating pads in hopes that her core temperature would start to rise. Jean was, however, not looking too great. Her pulse was registering around 12 beats per minute. Her body temperature measured at about 88 degrees, which was 10 degrees below the normal, and doctors knew that this was likely it for Jean. They would soon call Jean's pastor, and a prayer chain would be started for Jean while at the hospital. After about a few hours of trying, around 12 p.m., to everyone's surprise, Jean would miraculously wake up in a very stable state. Just a few hours ago, she was unconscious and frozen solid, and here she is now, speaking coherently and most concerned with her dad finding out she had crashed his car into a ditch as opposed to the condition she was in at the moment. At this point, people are explaining to Jean what had happened that night, and all she can remember is the getting into the accident, passing out on Wally's yard, and waking up to being in the hospital. Despite being awake, the ordeal was not over. Doctors would consider amputating both of Jean's legs to avoid infection from frostbite. However, they soon figured this would not be necessary, and Jean, who had just suffered this very concerning ordeal of severe hypothermia, is sent home with no more than blistered toes, which were numb for a little while. No other lingering health issues from this very scary ordeal. And apparently incidents like this were more common than one would think. David Plummer, a professor of emergency medicine at the University of Minnesota, would say that cases like this would happen so occasionally during his time in practice. He would explain how during these extreme cases of hypothermia, one's blood flow would slow down and the amount of oxygen they consume would decrease, almost like a form of hibernation to keep the most vital areas safe. And he would go on to say that recovery is made possible when one's blood flow increases at the same rate their body warms up. But in this case, this is what happened to Jean. No one is dead until they're warm and dead. What just made this case so miraculous was that during this time in the 1980s, all doctors had to work with were heating pads and prayers, as opposed to nowadays where patients are able to have their blood pumped through a special device with a heater which warms their vital organs from the insides. This makes treating severe hypothermia today a much easier task than it was back then. This story would make national headlines. Jean would go on to travel to multiple places telling her story, often dubbed as the miracle girl from Langby, Minnesota. However, despite all of the attention gained from this ordeal, Jean would go on to live a normal life. life. She would grow up, move to Cambridge, Minnesota, get married, have kids. Because of the nature of her being unconscious throughout the ordeal that cold winter night in 1980, this isn't something that Jean often thinks about. While of course thankful that she was able to survive such an experience, Jean mainly just makes it a point to always dress accordingly for the cold weather and to make sure she avoids icy black roads at nighttime. What do you think? This story was definitely a miracle. Thank you for watching. Take care of yourselves and stay tuned to hear more stories about the world's most interesting medical mysteries. Bye now.